My name's Audrey Collins. I worked as a professional genealogist for about 13 years before I joined the National Archives in 2002, and I am currently the family history specialist. I hope you all have already watched our webinar on 20th century records, or that you've already done some research in that period. When your research has taken you back to 1911 or earlier, you'll still be using many of the records that you should already be familiar with. And as with the sources we described in that webinar, most of these records relate to England and Wales. Birth, marriage and death registers from the General Register Office, or GRO, go back to 1837, and the National Collection of Wills and Administrations goes back to 1858. Those aren't our records, but you do need to use them in conjunction with our records to get the best out of them. And we've got research guides that will show you where you can find indexes online and then order copies of any documents you need. You may have already used the 1911 census, and when it's released you'll have the 1921 census. But it's during this period that the census really comes into its own for family history. We hold the census records for every 10 years from 1841 up to 1901, so we have 7 whole censuses to use. And the census is so very useful because it's one of the few types of records where you can see people in whole family groups and in their context. Now, of course, there are lots of other records in the National Archives and elsewhere that you might use in your family history research, but the census is the one that probably applies to everyone. For example, all adults could vote in the 20th century, or for most of it, so you can trace people through electoral registers. But once you get back to the Edwardian and Victorian eras, far fewer people could vote, so electoral registers are much less useful. And nearly every family has members who served in the armed forces in the 2 world wars because of conscription. But before 1911, this was not the case. Having said that, military and naval records are still among our most popular records with family historians, so keep an eye out for future webinars exploring both of those sources. Census Records gives so much detail that you can often draft a rough family tree just from the census alone. But of course, you need to use other sources to confirm what you've drawn up, or you might find you've jumped to the wrong conclusion. Remember, the census shows you where people were on one night every 10 years, and an awful lot could have happened in between. Also, the information in the census isn't always accurate. It's only as good as the person who gave the details in the first place. And by the time we get to see it, the information's been copied a couple of times. Indexes and transcriptions are wonderful, but you should always look at the record itself. Transcription is only what someone else thinks it says. I've got an example to show you what I mean. We start with a man called John Frederick Wyatt, born in London in 1879. His birth certificate gave me the names of his parents, William Thomas Wyatt and Harriet Mary Ann, whose maiden name was Roper. But the census can tell me a whole lot more about the entire family. Here they are in 1891. We can see William as the head of the family, and everyone else is described in relation to him, his wife Harriet, and several children. John Frederick is the only boy, and the youngest of the girls is so new that she hasn't even been named yet. Looking at the ages of the parents and the ages of the children, you could probably work out that the parents probably married sometime in the 1870s. And as well as the immediate family, there is William's sister-in-law, Annie Carter, and a nephew, Thomas Carter. In this case, I know that Annie Carter is actually Harriet's sister, but only because I've done a lot of research on this family. But you need to remember that at this time, the phrase in-law can mean a stepsister, or a stepbrother, or stepson, and so on. So if I only had the census to go on, I wouldn't know for certain she could have been William's stepsister. If we go back 10 years to the 1881 census, we can find out more about the family. John and his older sister Nellie, that we saw aged 11 and 12 in 1891, are there, and they're aged 1 and 2. And there's an older child, William. Assuming that these ages are right, he's 5 years older than Nellie, and Harriet would only have been 18 when he was born. So this made me suspect that perhaps Harriet wasn't his mother. And I was right. I found William and Harriet's marriage in 1877. William was a widower, and I also found his first marriage in 1872 to a Mary Jane Johnson. She died in 1875. So the 7-year-old William was William Thomas's son, but he wasn't Harriet's son. And I've been able to fill in all these details using the other record sources. So from William Thomas Wyatt's marriage certificates and the censuses, we know his approximate age and birthplace, and that his father was called John Wyatt and he was a tailor. William wasn't with his parents and the rest of his family in 1871. He'd left home by then. But here they are in 1861. And I did this research many years ago when nothing was online and there were very few name indexes. So I found them by searching for the address. And this was just as well, because the family appears as Hyatt, not Wyatt. And that's not a transcription error, because the enumerator has clearly written Hyatt and made a mistake when he copied the information from the household schedule. And there's something else going on here. William Thomas and his brother John are both shown as being 11 years old. And they can't be twins. I've seen William's birth certificate. He was born in January 1851, so he was actually 10 at the time of the census, not 11. And the two brothers have different birthplaces. So this is a timely reminder that the ages in the census are often out by a year or two, and for adults and older people, they can be out by even more. In the 1851 census, we can see that the boys were definitely not twins. William's age is exactly right, he's 2 months old, and his brother John is 1, although it looks a bit like a 7. It's very easy to mix these two numbers up, especially with all the other marks that are made on the page. He was actually born in the second half of 1849, so he was a year old. And the mother looks as though her name is Alfred, and that's how she's indexed, but if you look closely, you can see it is Agnes and seems to have been altered, and I have no explanation for that. Now, there's one more census earlier than this, 1841, but it contains much less detail than 1851 onwards. You only get names, approximate ages, and occupations. There's nothing on marital status or on relationships within the household, and the only clue to birthplaces is whether a person was born in the county where they're enumerated, or whether they were born in Scotland, Ireland, or foreign parts. So 1851 is a particularly important census. To research before the start of civil registration in 1837, you have to rely on church records, mainly Church of England, C.of.E., parish registers, which were never collected centrally. They're usually in county record offices or other local archives, so you need to know where to look for them. 1851, being the earliest census to show the parish and the county of birth, makes it your genealogical springboard to go back a generation. All the members of this family that we've seen so far were born in the London area, and it would be good to find John Wyatt's parents in 1851, if we could, to see where they were born. John and his wife, Agnes Greatorex, married in 1848 in Paddington. And their marriage entry tells us that his father, another John Wyatt, was also a tailor. This isn't a lot of information to go on, but when John Wyatt's address when he married was 26 Gerrard Street, Soho. Luckily for us, John Sr. and his wife Sarah and the rest of the family was still there in 1851. And the information here takes us back another generation, and it takes us out of London altogether, because John and Sarah were both born in parishes in Huntingdonshire, so we know that's where to look to research in earlier records. But parish registers aren't just useful for research before civil registration, they were still kept after 1837, and they're still kept today. They're mostly in county record offices, as I mentioned, but many of them are also now online, so you can often use them to help you with your research long after 1837. Baptism records give less information than birth certificates, no mother's maiden name, but they do give addresses and occupations, so they can still help you identify the right entry in the birth indexes. Marriage records are even better, because from 1837, church registers were exactly the same as the ones you get from the General Register Office. In fact, they're actually better, because they are the church registers with original signatures, and the ones that were sent to the GRO were just copies. So you may be able to find your ancestors' marriage entries on one of the big family history sites. You won't always be lucky, but if you can find an ancestor's church marriage entry, it will save you a lot of money on buying marriage certificates. Now, burial records are usually less helpful than baptisms or marriages because they contain not much information, but there is another source that can help you identify a right death entry in the indexes. You can use the indexes to wills and administrations. The system that's still in force today goes back to 1858, and the earliest of these indexes are actually the most detailed, often giving occupations, addresses, names of executors, who are often family members. The wills themselves, which you have to order, are sometimes very brief, but others give a lot of detail about family members. And even if no one in your family ever left a will, and you might be surprised just how many people did leave a will, you can still use the details in the indexes to rule out people of the same name who turn out not to be your ancestor. Before 1858, wills and administrations were dealt with by a variety of church courts. And because of the way the Church of England is organised, lots of wills from all over England and Wales, and even beyond, were proved in the top court in the hierarchy, the Archbishop of Canterbury is called. It was known as the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, short to PCC. We hold those records, and they're all online. In fact, they were the first records that the National Archives ever digitised and put online. You don't have to order copies of these wills. You can search them by name and then download and read the whole document on your own computer screen. These are just the main sources that everyone might expect to use, but of course there are lots of records in the National Archives and in other record offices that will be very useful for at least some people. If your ancestors didn't belong to the Church of England, we have a big collection of nonconformist records, and some records of births, marriage, deaths overseas. Some are in our Foreign Office collections, others relate to the armed forces. Some of these have been indexed and digitised, but many others haven't, although work is ongoing on this. From 1858 onwards, marriages in England and Wales could be dissolved by divorce, and we hold most of those records up to the 1930s. And for those up to around about the First World War, they're also digitised and indexed online. You might find records about your ancestors' education or perhaps their occupations, either in the National Archives or in local archives. You may find a lot of things in published sources, especially for the professions. And if your ancestors moved around the world, we have some passenger lists from 1890 onwards. And if your ancestor became a naturalised British subject at any time, we should have a record of that too. One of the advantages of researching records before 1911 is that, unlike later records, they're not going to be closed for privacy reasons. So while we can't look forward to more records being released, we can look forward to a lot of existing records being indexed, or better still, digitised as well. Now, although the 1921 census is later than the period we're talking about, it's still very relevant to researching your 19th century ancestors, because you should always try to find ancestors in as many census years as you can, including in their later life. You never know when you're going to find some extra piece of information, such as other family members who may be visiting. And no matter what record you're looking at, remember we have research guides to give you much more detail on the records than I've had time to give you here. And there are also lots of webinars and blog posts on our site too that will also help you. Finally, remember that the information in the census is only as good as the person providing it, and it won't always be accurate, as we've seen. So be flexible with your search terms. And before 1911, we only see what the enumerators copied into the enumeration books. We can't see what they copied from. So they may have struggled with unfamiliar names, unfamiliar places, or just plain bad handwriting. And the way that we find the census records now is mainly by name searching using online indexes. But you can still browse the census or search by place or address, and it's often worthwhile doing that. And don't just look at the individual household where your ancestor was. look at their neighbours, look at their surroundings. That can tell you an awful lot more about the life they could have led. I've been looking at the census practically every day for the last 30 years or so, and I am still finding new and interesting things in it, and I hope that you will too, and I hope that you will enjoy your research.